And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today's February the 20th. It is the 51st day of this new year. There's 314 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll go start a new one. Well, holidays and observances. It is National Love Your Pet Day. Nurturing an unbreakable bond with your furry little companion. It's a profound connection that enriches your life with boundless affection and energy. International Pipe Smoking Day. Explore the rich tradition of pipe smoking, a timeless ritual steeped in history and cultural significance. National Comfy Day. World Care Day. National Caregivers Day. National Cherry Pie Day. National Muffin Day. National Day of Solidarity with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian immigrants. Friday Fish Fry Day. World Day of Social Justice. The problem is a lot of people think their idea... Okay, my system stopped for some reason. As I was saying, National Day of Solidarity with Muslim and Arab and South Asian immigrants. It's Friday Fish Fry Day, World Day of Social Justice, International Lego Classism Day, can't talk, National Tartar Sauce Day, Clean Out Your Bookcase Day, Hoodie Who Day, National Whistleblower Reward Day, National Leadership Day, National Handcuff Day, Women in Blue Jeans Day. That's always a sight to see. No Politics Day. In a world of never-ending political drama. Put down the news and turn off the debates and bask in the freedom of a politics-free existence. National Student Volunteer Day. Yukon Heritage Day. Carnival of Brazil. Samba music and vibrant costumes and non-stop dancing. Annual festival in Rio de Janeiro's the ultimate party. If it's an experience you just will not forget. National Nest Box Week. National Entrepreneurship Week. Adelaide Fringe. Cancer Prevention Action Week. Hockey Week across America. Real Bread Week. Make Mine Chocolate. National Condom Week. Simplot Games. National Chip Week. In many places, chips are called French fries. Whipping Crane Festival. Love Teaching Week. Brotherhood and Sisterhood Week. National Drink Wine with Your Cat Week. That's what we need is more drunk cats. National Pancake Week. Random Acts of Kindness Week. Artes Mundi. National Green Week. Maslenitsa Festival. Girl Scout Cookie Week. Take Your Family to School Week. Through with the Chew. Alzheimer's Disease and Dementia Care Staff Education Week. Build a Better Trade Show Image Week. And Ramadan. It's considered a holy month by the Muslims. And they fast from sunrise to sunset. Focus on spiritual reflection and community. Time for self-improvement. Famous people born on this date: Kurt Cobain, Mitch McConnell, Chelsea Peretti, Ivana Trump, and Sidney Poitier. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news on this interesting Friday. Things are moving slow this morning, apparently. Well, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is still in the news. President Trump has ripped the tech disclosures. Reward hits $200,000 through an anonymous donation. And a neighbor who knows Guthrie says community is very concerned. everybody's installed cameras after her disappearance. A neighbor who's known the missing 84-year-old woman says the community's still struggling to process her disappearance and taking new steps to protect their own homes. Lloyd Anderson, who lives near Guthrie and attended church with her, told Fox News that he recently installed some security cameras after her disappearance. Now, she had them, but apparently they were bypassed by the intruder. He said he's had alarms and just recently put cameras in, confirming upgrades came after she vanished. He said the situation has been unsettling for neighbors. It's certainly different. We've never gone through this before. Something we just have to live through. And I knew Nancy, and I think she was a wonderful lady. I think we just got to give her our best wishes and hope for God's help. He said he knew her from church and from seeing her around the neighborhood. Well, an Olympian, Eileen Gu, says she feels like a punching bag after the backlash for competing with China against the U.S. She's American-born, but she's a teen China skier. Responded to global criticism she's received from during the Milan Cortina Winter Olympics. Her decision to compete for China, despite being born in the U.S., has made her a target for Americans and others across the world, with Vice President Vance chiming in by saying he hopes athletes from here would want to compete with the U.S. and not against it. She says, I'm flattered. Thanks, JD. That's sweet. When she heard about Vance's comments. She was asked if she recently feels like a bit of a punching bag for a certain stand of American politics, and said she did. She says so many athletes compete for a different country. People only have a problem with me doing it because they kind of lump China into the monolithic entity, and they just hate China. So it's not really about what they think it's about. And also because I win. If I wasn't doing well, I think they probably wouldn't care as much, and that's okay for me. People are entitled to their opinion. She's previously said she was physically assaulted for her decision to represent China. Police were called. I've had death threats. I've had my dorm robbed. I've gone through some things as a 22-year-old that I really think nobody'd have to endure. Well, she'll compete in the women's freestyle skiing halfpipe final on Thursday after winning silver in her first two events. It'll be a climax of an Olympic, definitely defined by global criticism for Gu. Well, you kind of have to decide where your loyalties lie. Well, the red state auditors reported flags and the Democratic governors concerning standing on luxury expenditures. Kentucky's Republican auditor, Allison Ball, spoke to Fox News this week about a report she put out flagging concerns about lavish spending in the state's executive branch headed by Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, who's widely believed to have presidential ambitions down the road. They issued a report earlier this month outlining spending by the executive branch in fiscal year 2025 that was entered into the state system, and flagged issues she believes demonstrate extravagant spending of tax dollars that needs to stop. Concerning expenditures listed included $183,576 in out-of-state travel costs, included $7,632 for a limousine in Germany, $17,013 dinner in a Kentucky distillery, and $360,000 for 75 people to attend a two-day conference within the Commonwealth. She told Fox News, we really saw some really excessive, really worrying and questionable expenditures. One of the things they saw was the governor and the tourism cabinet spending $338,000 on a nonprofit called First Saturday in May. So for people who are not from Kentucky, the first Saturday in May is when Kentucky Derby happens. So that money actually went to events for VIPs to come in and celebrate and observe the Derby. Well, the taxpayers funding a lot of these so-called political elites to have an unbelievable life. Well, ex-Victoria's Secret CEO lawyer has been caught on a hot mic jokingly threatening to kill him at Epstein's deposition. The ex-Victoria's Secret mogul Les Wexner's lawyer was caught on a hot mic jokingly threatening to kill himself, kill him if he continued giving long answers to questions during his deposition on Jeffrey Epstein by the House Oversight Committee. The moment was called after the committee released its full, nearly 5-hour deposition of 88-year-old Wexner as part of his ongoing probe into the Jeffrey Epstein network. You know, if you have an interest in the Epstein situation, you might check out my book that you can find on Amazon Kindle or on Hudnallfiles.com. It's called The Death of Jeffrey Epstein, and we found some material that absolutely is going to shock you. The truly fascinating part of the Epstein situation is just how many people have that man touched. And now, all these finger pointers, many of them are finding their own names being released, such as Whoopi Goldberg. Well, Marsha Blackburn sent a letter to Apple CEO seeking answers on the news app's alleged bias. Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican of Tennessee, sent a letter to Apple CEO Tim Cook seeking answers on the alleged political bias plaguing the company's popular news app, Apple News. She said, "I write to express my concern with the recent reporting that Apple News has systematically suppressed news articles from conservative publications while amplifying articles from liberal outlets." She wrote that on Thursday, according to a copy of the letter obtained by Fox News. American public increasingly relies on services like Apple News to provide them with information, and they deserve to have access to perspectives across the political spectrum. To deny consumers that ability through algorithmic promotion or editorial bias is a disservice to those that use your product, she said. Well, again, these elites seem to believe their belief is the only belief anybody ought to have. I know I was removed from Facebook for not being liberal enough, which I thought was a fascinating position for them to take. I thought I was entitled to my own opinion, but apparently I'm not. Well, 6 mothers who cherished their time together were among the victims in an avalanche near Lake Tahoe. At least 6 of the victims have been identified in the tragic avalanche incident that took place Tuesday. Killed up to 9 people in Sierra Nevada, which is near Lake Tahoe, California. 6 of the victims among a group of outdoor-loving mothers who regularly travel together. A joint statement from the affected families identified the women as Kate Vitt, Carrie Atkin, Danielle Keatley, Kate Morse, and sisters Carolyn Sikar and Liz Claiborne. "We're devastated beyond words," the family said in the statement. "Our focus right now is supporting our children through this incredible tragedy and honoring the lives of these extraordinary women. All were described as mothers and wives and friends, all of whom are connected through the love of the outdoors." Well, it's avalanches happen. Well, an organized South American crime group has burglarized over 60 high-end Houston area homes targeting designer goods. More than 60 high-end homes across the Houston area have been hit in a sweeping burglary spree tied to a South American theft ring using signal jammers and counterintelligence tactics and to evade detection. That's according to West University Police Chief Gary Ratliff. His organized crime network, known as the South American Theft Group, has been linked to numerous break-ins in West University Place, surrounding counties, and across the country, according to authorities. Residents packed a public safety meeting Wednesday night in West University Place, where Rattler formed at the group's footprints expanding beyond Houston. According to resident Bill Jones, it was shocking. People from South America terrorizing Americans. Pretty scary and unfortunate. I'm really surprised nobody's gotten hurt so far. You know, you have to remember when, especially in Texas, you hear somebody breaking in, rather than running and hiding and grabbing the cell phone and calling the police, most folks get a reach for a gun. Well, an ancient burial site that workers stumbled upon. Incredibly rare find made during a sewer project. Workers installing a new sewer line in Scotland unexpectedly uncovered ancient human remains as well as evidence of a much older settlement than anybody thought would anticipated would be there. The burial site dates back to the 6th century A.D., according to a January 28 press release from Scottish Water. It was found at Windhill in the Scottish Highlands. Remarkably, archaeologists have also found 2 roundhouses from the Iron Age. It may date back as far as 3,000 years. Excavators also found stone tools and 2 smelting furnaces that would have been housed in structures outside the roundhouse. And these furnaces would likely produce significant heat and fumes, precluding them from being set within an enclosed space. Well, the ancient peoples were far more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. Well, former Prince Andrew was arrested yesterday on suspicion of misconduct in public office, according to King Charles. Thames Valley Police arrested Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, former Prince Andrew, on the 19th, his birthday, on suspicion of misconduct in public office. His brother, King Charles III, reacted to Andrew's arrest in a statement issued by Buckingham Palace. Former Prince has faced public scrutiny due to his ties to the late Jeffrey Epstein, who died by apparent suicide in a Manhattan jail cell in 2019. But if you read my book, there's a lot of questions about that, questions that nobody's wanting to answer. The family of Virginia Roberts Guthrie, one of the most prominent Epstein and former Prince Andrew accusers, reacted to news of the arrest. Guthrie, if you remember, died by an apparent suicide in 2025. Former Prince Andrew declared in an October 2025 statement he no longer uses title or the honors that have been conferred on him. As I've said previously, I vigorously deny the accusations made against me. And that same month, King Charles III initiated a formal process to remove the style and titles and honors of Prince Andrew, noting that he will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. He was released from police custody on the 19th, hours after he got arrested, returned to Sandringham Estate, where he'd been temporarily living at the Wood Farm. Well, you have to ask yourself what America's most powerful warship brings to the Middle East as the Iranian tensions surge. Pentagon is deploying USS Gerald R. Ford in the Middle East, creating a rare 2-carrier presence in the region as tensions with Iran rise and questions swirl about possible U.S. military action. The Ford will reinforce the USS Abraham Lincoln, already operating in the theater, significantly expanding American air power at a moment of heightened regional uncertainty. While officials haven't announced imminent action, the dual-carrier presence increased the Pentagon's flexibility, of course. It's the Ford is the largest, most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. It has the capability of actually conducting a war on its own. Well, the View panel erupted as a guest defended President Trump against racism claims being made by Sunny Hostin. Conservative guest host Savannah Crisley defended President Trump against those who call him a racist. Chief among those was co-host Sunny Hostin. They discussed Trump's celebration of Black History Month at the White House. According to Crisley, I think you know when it comes to the event that happened yesterday, it's hard for me to witness it. people stating the president's a racist because I've seen him firsthand. He saved one of my best friends' lives, a black woman who'd been for him for ever, and at that point, Hostin interrupted, he's a racist. And then it developed into one of the usual view back and forth. Well, when an A means an average, even Harvard's got a problem, and they know it. Last year, the average GPA for Harvard University's class of 2025 was 3.83. At Harvard, one of the world's most selective colleges, the average student graduating in 2025 had a 3.83 GPA on a 4.0 scale. That meant the typical student received an A or an A minus in nearly every class they took. And having 5 degrees myself, I know how difficult that can be. Harvard has plenty of company. Yale's average GPA was a similarly laughable 3.7 in 2023. Nearly 80% of grades in the A to A minus range. Public universities boosted grades by 17% between 1990 and 2020. And K through 12 schooling grades keep going up even though test scores haven't. You have to ask yourself, has somebody got their thumb on the scales? I would tend to think that is definitely the case. Well, the woman's been charged with animal abandonment after leaving her dog tied at a JetBlue counter in the Las Vegas airport. She was arrested at a Las Vegas airport after she allegedly tied her dog to a baggage sizer at a JetBlue ticket counter and walked away. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department responded to Harry Reid International Airport on February 2nd after getting reports that a dog had been tied to a metal carry-on luggage sizer and left behind at the airport's JetBlue ticket counter. Woman was arrested on charges of animal abandonment and resisting arrest. Footage released by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department showed the woman, whose face was blurred in the video, approaching the ticket counter with her dog before she walked away and left the dog's leash tied to the counter. Well, officers told the woman she'd receive a citation for leaving her dog at the counter. And she says, well, I was trying to rebook my flight. So you walked out here to rebook your flight, the officer asked, and she said, that's what they told me to do at the counter. And you walked out and left your dog? According to the police, airline staff told the dog owner she hadn't completed the required forms online to travel with the animal as a service dog was denied a boarding pass. So she left the dog behind and went through the airport to the departure gate. And no animal deserves that type of treatment, is my belief. Well, yesterday we were talking about the mysterious death of Marilyn Monroe. For over 60 years, there have been questions about her death, but discussion alone has never resolved the matter. Reason simple. Conversation can't substitute for examination. Now, we didn't write Marilyn Monroe, The Questions That Never Died, to advance a single theory. We didn't want to replace one certainty with another. We wrote it to restore content and context, to bring back questions that were prematurely set aside, and to show how easily ambiguity can be mistaken for closure. Official conclusion surrounding her death has endured largely because it was insulated from challenge early on. Once the narrative hardened, later inquiry was framed as exploitation rather than investigation. And when you got a death that involves the likes of JFK and RFK and Peter Lawford and a number of other A-list names, people get very careful about asking questions. And the way that case was framed discouraged reassessment, even as contradictions accumulated. But history doesn't belong to institutions alone. It belongs to the record and to those who are willing to read it critically. She lived at a crossroads of power and vulnerability and visibility. Her death occurred in an environment where discretion mattered, reputations mattered, silence mattered. When certainty was imposed without convergence, the cost wasn't the truth, it was trust. And if we accomplished anything with the investigation we did, It's the restoration of a basic principle. Unanswered questions are not disrespectful. An inquiry is not accusation. She deserves to be remembered not only as an icon, but as a human being whose final hours were never fully explained. The questions didn't die because they're malicious. They survived because they were reasonable. Now, we reconstructed a timeline of her final days. In July and early August of 1962, she was reportedly emotionally distressed but socially engaged. She continued medical treatment for insomnia and anxiety, and she expressed frustration with personal and professional relationships. August 3rd of 1962, multiple accounts describe her as agitated but communicative. Conversations reportedly included expressions of feeling betrayed and anger. On August 4th, evening phone calls were reported, but the timelines conflict. No authoritative phone log reconstruction has ever been published, and accounts differ on her mood and intent. August 5th, 1962, found unresponsive in her Brentwood home. Authorities notified after delay, described differently by various witnesses. Nobody's given a definitive answer as to why that delay took place. And the scene was disturbed prior to law enforcement arriving. There are a number of folks at her diary, which everybody knew she kept, vanished completely. The timeline lacks a single authoritative reconstruction. There were gaps that can't be reconciled after the fact. And witnesses' accounts showed a number of areas of agreement and conflict. Now, areas of general agreement. She was emotionally distressed in the days preceding her death, and she's making phone calls late into the night on August 4th, and she did have access to prescription medication. There's no disagreement on those 3 points. But where there is disagreement, who's the last person to speak to her, and when was that? Who first realized she was unresponsive? And what was the sequence of notifications to authorities? And what was the degree of urgency perceived before discovery? Well, the problem, not who profited from her death, but who profited from her silence. That is certainly a major point that has to be raised. And when you got some of the most powerful people in the country being involved with this woman, it does raise quite a number of fascinating questions. Well, we're going to turn from the death of Marilyn Monroe to the death of another individual who was actually very much entangled with Marilyn Monroe. I'm talking about John F. Kennedy himself, the President of the United States. We wrote a book called Dead Witnesses. All the mysterious deaths that surrounded the assassination of President Kennedy. Over 50 people involved, even peripherally, with the assassination of the president, were found dead of mysterious reasons, mysterious causes. And so many of them were put down to just misadventure, suicide. One individual was killed with a karate chop to the throat, and the police wrote it off as a suicide. Now, there was a pattern nobody wanted to see in all these deaths. Now, history often presents itself as a series of isolated moments, events that appear self-contained, neatly bounded by dates and official conclusions. But some events refuse to remain isolated. They echo forward in time, creating disturbances that don't settle, questions that don't close, and consequences that resist explanation. The assassination of John F. Kennedy is one of those events. It was November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was murdered in full public view. Within hours, shock gave way to fear. Within days, fear gave way to urgency. Within weeks, urgency gave way to closure, at least official closure. The American public was told the crime had been solved. A lone nut gunman acting alone. No conspiracy, nothing to see here. Move along. He was driven by personal grievances and political extremism. And this one individual ended the life of the President of the United States. The nation was assured the case was closed. But history has a way of leaving fingerprints where it doesn't want to be touched. Almost immediately, cracks appeared in the official account. Witnesses described shots from directions that didn't align with the lone gunman theory. Medical personnel reported wounds inconsistent with the publicly described trajectory. Law enforcement officers gave statements that conflicted with one another. Journalists uncovered leads that raised uncomfortable questions. Investigators, both official and independent, found evidence that didn't fit cleanly into the explanation being offered. But then something else began to happen. People began to die. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic wave, but steadily, persistently, and in patterns that are easy to ignore if you were determined not to look too closely. Witnesses who had contradicted the official story died in accidents, and investigators died suddenly before publishing their findings. Journalists died under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Individuals who claimed foreknowledge of the assassination meant violent ends. Others who were scheduled to testify or retestify to bodies like the Warren Commission died shortly before doing so. And each death, considered in isolation, could be explained away. A car accident here, a heart attack there, a suicide ruled without a thorough investigation, or an illness that arrived with improbable speed. Now, coincidence is a powerful shield. It requires no conspiracy, no coordination, no intent, just repetition without scrutiny. And for years, coincidence was enough. But coincidence has limits. When an unusually high number of people connected to a single historical event die prematurely, especially when these people share a common trait, such as possessing inconvenient knowledge, the explanation of randomness begins to fail. Probability doesn't collapse under a single anomaly. It collapses under accumulation. We're going to talk about that accumulation. Dead witnesses doesn't begin with an assumption of guilt, and it doesn't advance a single monolithic conspiracy theory. Instead, it documents a phenomena. The systematic disappearance through death, intimidation, or silence of individuals connected to the assassination of President Kennedy. And some of those individuals are eyewitnesses standing in Dealey Plaza. Others are police officers, federal agents, intelligence assets. Some are journalists who refused to let the case go. Others are medical professionals, investigators, or peripheral figures whose only mistake was being too close to the truth at the wrong time. What unites them is not ideology, politics, or profession. What unites them is that they became inconvenient. Official investigations focused narrowly on how Kennedy was killed. Far less attention was paid to what happened afterward, particularly to the people who challenged, complicated, or threatened the narrative that emerged so quickly. The Warren Commission cataloged evidence, but it did not examine the fate of the witnesses who provided it. Later inquiries revisited ballistics and timelines, but largely ignored the growing body count surrounding the case. And that omission is not trivial by any means. It is central. In criminal investigations, witnesses' intimidation is recognized as a hallmark of organized wrongdoing. When witnesses disappear, investigators ask why. When witnesses die, investigators look for patterns. When they die in clusters, the investigators assume intent until proven otherwise. But in the case of the Kennedy assassination, this basic investigative logic was rarely applied. Instead, the deaths were scattered across footnotes, dismissed in passing, or ignored altogether. Well, we've, through the publishing of Dead Witnesses, brought all this together in one place. Here the witnesses are named, their roles are identified, the circumstances of their death are documented, and their connection to Dealey Plaza, to Lee Harvey Oswald, to Jack Ruby, to law enforcement, to the intelligence operations are examined carefully without exaggeration. Now, some folks are going to find the conclusions unsettling. Others are going to find them overdue. But the actual purpose of this research is not to replace one official story with another. It's to restore visibility to the people who are quietly erased from history, and to ask a question that's been lingered unanswered for more than 6 decades. Why did so many people connected to the assassination of President Kennedy not live long enough to tell their full stories? The pattern's there. The pattern was visible. But for a very long time, it was a pattern nobody wanted to see. Well, it all began mid-morning on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, and Dallas was already a tense city. President John F. Kennedy was scheduled to arrive shortly before noon, and the city had spent days preparing for a visit that the local officials hoped would showcase unity in a politically divided state. Texas had been a hostile ground for Kennedy before. Adlai Stevenson had been physically assaulted in Dallas just weeks before. Handbills accusing Kennedy of treason had circulated openly. Federal authorities were aware of the hostility, but the motorcade route remained unchanged. At 11:37 a.m., Air Force One touched down at Love Field. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy disembarked to cheering crowds. The atmosphere, at least on the surface, appeared celebratory. Few in attendance could have imagined within an hour the most consequential crime of the 20th century to unfold in full public view. And many of those who witnessed it would not live long after it happened. Presidential motorcade left Love Field at 11:50 a.m., winding its way through downtown Dallas toward the Trade Mart, where Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a luncheon address. The route was printed in newspapers, announced on the radio, and known well in advance. Security was conspicuously light by modern standards. No sealed rooftops, no counter-sniper teams, no meaningful crowd control beyond local police on motorcycles. Shortly after 12:30 in the afternoon, the motorcade turned onto Elm Street and entered Dealey Plaza. Now, even though we've all heard the name for years, Dealey Plaza is deceptively small. What appears expansive in photographs is in reality a confined space bordered by a railroad overpass, a concrete pergola, sloping grass, and a 6-story Texas schoolbook depository. The slow downward curve of Elm Street forced the presidential limousine to reduce speed dramatically. Witnesses later estimated the car was traveling no more than 11 miles an hour. And at this moment, when the vehicle was its most vulnerable, the shooting began. Now, accounts differ on the exact number of shots that were fired. Some witnesses heard 2, others heard 3, and others 4, even more. Several reported shots came from different directions. One sharp crack echoed through the plaza, followed by a pause and then another. People froze, uncertain whether they were hearing fireworks or gunfire. But within seconds, chaos erupted. President Kennedy was struck. Governor Connally, seated in front of him, was hit. Blood, bone fragments, and panic filled the open limousine. Jacqueline Kennedy climbed onto the rear of the vehicle, reaching for something witnesses later would struggle to describe. Secret Service agent Cliff Hill ran toward the car and jumped on the back as it accelerated out of the plaza. Shooting was over in less than 10 seconds. What followed was confusion on a scale rarely seen in a public crime. Police officers ran in multiple directions. Some rushed toward the Texas schoolbook depository. Others splintered up the grassy knoll where many bystanders insisted shots had originated. Several witnesses reported seeing smoke near the wooden fence on top of the knoll. At least one railroad employee observed suspicious activity behind the fence moments before the assassination took place. Within minutes, the president was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. And almost immediately, the machinery of official explanation began to move. Early afternoon, law enforcement attention narrowed rapidly onto one single individual, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine employed at the Texas School Book Depository. And he was arrested not at the scene, but at a movie theater after the shooting of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, an event that itself had raised troubling questions about timing, location, and identity. And before midnight, Oswald was publicly labeled the assassin. Before 48 hours had passed, Oswald himself was dead. November 24th, 1963, in the base of the Dallas Police Headquarters, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped forward from a crowd of reporters and police officers and shot Oswald point blank on live TV. The accused assassin never stood a trial. No cross-examination occurred. No jury was seated. No defense was mounted. But Oswald was silenced. And at that point, the official story hardened quickly. One lone gunman, acting alone, motivated by personal ideology, fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But the problem for the government, the witnesses were still alive, and a lot of them didn't accept that explanation. In the days and weeks after the assassination, dozens of individuals, civilians, law enforcement officers, journalists, medical professionals, and intelligence-linked figures gave statements that contradicted the emerging narrative. Some described shots from the front. Others reported additional gunmen. Several raised questions about the autopsy and the handling of evidence and the conduct of authorities. And what happened next is the actual subject of this book and this show and the investigation that we've conducted. Over the months and years that followed, November 22nd, 1963, an extraordinary number of people connected directly and indirectly with the assassination died under unusual circumstances. Some were killed violently. Others died in apparent accidents. Several deaths were ruled suicides, often amid evidence of fear and pressure or prior threats. And still others succumbed to sudden illnesses at improbably young ages. Individually, each death could be explained away. Collectively, they formed a pattern that defies statistical expectation. Where journalists who pursued leads aggressively died before publishing their findings. Witnesses scheduled to testify passed away shortly before they had time to testify. Individuals who recanted earlier statements or claimed foreknowledge met abrupt ends. And even those tasked with investigating the crime, police officers, intelligence operatives, and informants, they weren't immune to deaths either. We don't claim that every death was the result of murder. It doesn't require such an assertion. The argument presented here is a lot more restrained, and as a result, a lot more troubling. When a single event produces an unusually high concentration of premature deaths among witnesses, investigators, and peripheral participants, the burden of explanation shifts. Coincidence becomes less persuasive as repetition accumulates. Randomness fails when patterns emerge. And the assassination of President Kennedy was not merely a murder. Oh no. It was a rupture in American history. And the deaths that followed it, silent, scattered, and often forgotten, are part of that rupture. Dealey Plaza was the beginning. But that story doesn't end there by any means. Well, in what we investigated and wrote, individuals cataloged in this book are examined not as abstractions, but as people. People who saw something. People who knew something were threatened simply by existing to complicate a story that powerful interests were eager to close. They were witnesses, and far too many of them died inexplicably. Well, when the shooting began in Dealey Plaza, the first people to encounter the truth of what was happening were not investigators, analysts, or government officials. They were ordinary citizens standing along the parade route, police officers directing traffic, railroad employees on duty, and spectators who come to see the president pass by. In other words, they were eyewitnesses. And in any criminal investigation, eyewitness testimony forms the foundation upon which all later conclusions rest. While eyewitness accounts are imperfect and subject to human error, of course, patterns across multiple independent witnesses are treated as critical indicators, especially when those patterns contradict an official explanation. And in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, those patterns emerged almost immediately. A lot of witnesses reported hearing shots from the front of the motorcade rather than from behind it. Others described seeing movement, smoke, or suspicious activity near the wooden fence on the grassy knoll. Several recalled the sounds of gunfire echoing in ways inconsistent with a single rifle fire from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And these accounts were not isolated by any means. They came from people standing in different locations with different vantage points that didn't know one another and had no reason to coordinate their statements. And what happened to those witnesses afterwards was one of the most troubling aspects of the assassination. Now, one of the most significant vantage points overlooking Dealey Plaza was the railroad tower west of the School Book Depository. In his elevated position, a railroad employee had a clear view of the grassy knoll, the pergola, and the area behind the wooden fence. His name was Lee Bowers. He stated that moments before the assassination, he saw two men standing behind the fence on the knoll. He described unusual activity in that area, including a flash or disturbance consistent with gunfire. His testimony directly challenged the notion that all shots came from the rear. We cooperated with investigators and repeated his story consistently. Never claimed certainty about the identity of the individuals he saw, but he was firm about what he had seen. In 1966, 3 years after the assassination, he died in a single-car automobile accident. That crash occurred on a rural Texas road under circumstances that raised questions about among those familiar with the case. Reportedly suffered injuries inconsistent with a typical collision, and witnesses noted anomalies at the scene. But officially, his death was immediately ruled an accident. Unofficially, it removed one of the clearest eyewitnesses to activity on the grassy knoll. Standing near the knoll at the time of the shooting was a lady named Jean Hill, sometimes referred to in the press as a lady in red, due to her clothing that day. She said repeatedly she heard a shot come from the front of the motorcade and that the sound was unmistakable. Her account contradicted the official conclusion almost immediately. She later described being pressured by authorities to alter her statement. She reported intimidation, surveillance, and harassment that lasted for years. And though she lived to old age, her health deteriorated under the strain of public scrutiny and private fear. Her experience illustrates a recurring theme. Not all witnesses were silenced by death. Some were silenced by pressure. Others weren't so fortunate. Another key witness was a lady named Mary Mormon. Stood only feet from the presidential limousine, took a Polaroid photograph at the moment of the fatal headshot, and the image she captured became one of the most analyzed photographs in American history. Mormon's photograph appeared to show an anomalous shape behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. There were many witnesses associated with gunfire. Her camera and photograph were seized by authorities and held for extended periods. And though she cooperated fully, she later described ongoing harassment and pressure. Her testimony and photograph were repeatedly minimized or dismissed. Lived for decades after the assassination, but her role as a witness is effectively neutralized through official neglect rather than overt elimination. One of the most disturbing eyewitness accounts came from Gordon Arnold, who claimed to be standing on the grassy knoll with a movie camera at the time of the shooting. He said immediately after the shots were fired, he was confronted by a man who identified himself as a federal agent. According to Arnold, his camera and film were confiscated. The film never surfaced again. He later maintained that he heard shots from the knoll and his film would have captured critical evidence. Lived in obscurity and fear for years, reluctant to speak publicly. His testimony, had it been preserved on film, would have been invaluable. Instead, it vanished. Among the most overlooked eyewitnesses was a man named Ed Hoffman, who stood near the triple underpass at the time of the assassination. He was deaf, relied on visual observation rather than sound. Later described seeing suspicious activity behind the fence and individuals fleeing the area immediately after the shooting. Because he couldn't hear the shots, his testimony avoided many of the ambiguities associated with the sound perception, but his account was largely ignored by official investigators. Never called to testify before the Warren Commission, he died in 2001. His observation is still absent from the official record. Well, these individuals didn't share political views, occupations, or social circles. What they shared was proximity to the event itself and to information that complicated the official narrative. Now, some eyewitnesses died under questionable circumstances. Others lived but were marginalized, intimidated, or ignored. And still others lost evidence that might have clarified what happened in Dealey Plaza. Together, their experiences reveal an early pattern. Witnesses whose accounts suggested multiple shooters or alternative firing locations faced consequences that witnesses supporting the official version did not. And this pattern didn't end with civilian bystanders. The focus also shifted in our research to law enforcement officers, first responders, and government personnel. Men whose professional duty required them to tell the truth and who in many cases paid a heavy price for telling that truth. Dealey Plaza produced witnesses, but what followed determined which of them would be remembered and which would be erased. Now, in any homicide investigation, law enforcement officers occupy a unique position. You're not casual observers or distant analysts. They arrive early, secure scenes, collect evidence, interview witnesses, and make decisions that shape the official record. Their credibility is presumed. Their statements carry weight. Their professional obligations are clear. Tell the truth as accurately as possible. When the assassination of John F. Kennedy, law enforcement officers were everywhere, directing traffic, responding to gunfire, pursuing suspects, and managing the chaotic aftermath. A lot of them saw or heard things that didn't fit the lone gunman narrative that would soon dominate official explanations. What happened to several of those officers afterward raises a number of profound questions. Keep in mind, as almost immediately the lone gunman scenario was put forward, and the government never deviated from that. And once they had the name of a potential lone nut gunman, everything hardened. Now, at approximately 1:15 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, that's less than 45 minutes after the assassination, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit himself was shot and killed in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. According to the official story, Tippit encountered Lee Harvey Oswald, attempted to question him, and was murdered in cold blood. Oswald was subsequently arrested and charged with Tippit's killing. But from the very beginning, the Tippit case was riddled with inconsistencies. Witness descriptions of the shooter conflicted. Shell casing evidence was contradictory. Timeline reconstruction strained credibility. Several witnesses later expressed uncertainty about Oswald's identity and identification. Others recanted and modified their statements under pressure. What remained undeniable was one thing. Tippit's death served a critical narrative function. It transformed Oswald from a suspect into a cop killer, eliminating sympathy and accelerating the demand for swift resolution. Tippit never testified. His killing removed a uniformed officer from the chain of events. The officer may have been acting on instructions that were never fully explained. Now, Dallas County Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig was among the first officers to respond to the Texas School Book Depository. He later stated he saw a man he believed to be Oswald leave the scene in a Nash Rambler station wagon driven by another individual. Yet observation directly contradicted the official narrative of Oswald acting alone. And Craig repeated this account consistently and publicly. Well, the consequences were swift and severe. He was ostracized within law enforcement circles, denied promotions, and eventually forced out of his profession. And he also reported multiple attempts on his life, including being run off the road and shot at. And his credibility was attacked relentlessly. In 1975, he was found dead from a gunshot wound. The death was immediately ruled a suicide, very little investigation involved. Those that knew him rejected that conclusion. He had remained determined to tell what he believed to be the truth and expressed fear for his life. And his death occurred just as renewed public interest in the assassination began to grow. Another law enforcement witness was gone, mysteriously. There was one woman who controlled Oswald's timeline. Her name was Earlene Roberts. She managed the rooming house where Oswald lived. Her testimony is crucial because it directly affected his movements immediately after the assassination. Roberts told investigators Oswald came back to the rooming house shortly after the shooting, appeared calm, and left quickly. Well, her accounts raised serious questions about whether Oswald could have traveled from the 6th floor of the schoolbook depository to the location of Officer Tippett's murder within the time frame asserted by the authorities. And she later expressed confusion and concern over how her statements were represented. Indicated that investigators attempted to steer her testimony into an alignment with a pre-established timeline. 1966, before she could retestify or clarify her account, she died of a heart attack at the age of just 41. Her death eliminated a key witness whose testimony complicated the official reconstruction of events. Then there was Dallas police officer Buddy Walters. He reportedly spoke openly about irregularities in the assassination investigation and expressed concern that the evidence was being mishandled. In 1964, Walters was shot and killed under circumstances officially described as unrelated to the Kennedy case. And naturally, his case received very little national attention, when in actuality it should have. Not every law enforcement witness died violently. Some were neutralized through institutional pressure. Officer Joe Marshall Smith later claimed he was instructed to falsely identify a suspect resembling Oswald in a police lineup. He stated he refused to comply and subsequently faced threats and harassment. He lived, but his professional life was destroyed. Other officers who questioned evidence handling or witness treatment found themselves reassigned, marginalized, or silenced through administrative means. Their concerns rarely made it into official reports. What distinguishes law enforcement witnesses from civilian bystanders is the weight of their testimony. Officers are trained observers. They understand procedures, evidence chains, investigative integrity. When multiple officers independently report irregularities, when those officers suffer disproportionately severe consequences, the implications are very difficult to ignore. Some died violently, some died suddenly, some were silenced without dying at all. Together they formed a second ring around the assassination, closer to power and closer to evidence, and therefore more dangerous to an official narrative that demanded simplicity and closure. Well, we're going to, in our next show, on Monday, because this is Friday, don't you know, attention's going to turn to another critical group, the employees of the Texas Schoolbook Depository itself. Men and women whose proximity to the alleged crime scene placed them at the center of one of the most contested locations in American history. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow. On Monday. And we will talk more about some of the unsolved deaths related to the assassination of President Kennedy. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday.